Hi, my name is Jennifer Henderson. For my signature project, I chose to look at the achievement gap on statewide test scores and math proficiency at my school. This project hit close to home for me because I teach at a Title I school and I have been teaching for 19 years, so I've seen the minority students in my school seem to achieve more poorly in math compared to white students. My principal's also been concerned with this and brought this to our attention as a faculty, and I've talked with him about what I could do for a school improvement plan that would address this concern. So with me being directly affected by the math scores at my school, I chose to focus on math achievement scores and the achievement gap that we see. An achievement gap is a word used to indicate the academic deficits of all students, demographics, particularly minorities, who continuously underperform on standardized testing. The national achievement gap between African American and white students has recently become a significant source of concern for all districts as they face the consequences with these subgroups of children being left behind. So as educators, we're faced with an extraordinary task in closing these achievement gaps in our classrooms. Like other schools across the nation, Saraland Elementary has that problem of achievement gaps on statewide test scores with students from minority groups that tend to score lower than other students. The research question for my signature project was, how do school administrators and teachers close the achievement gap between African American and white elementary school students at Saraland Elementary? And my thesis was that if we improve instructional strategies that are administered by the teachers at Saraland Elementary, we could positively affect the proficiency of minorities on statewide testing. The problem this study addressed was an achievement gap on these statewide test scores in minority student groups. There were several possible explanations for why achievement gaps persist. At the individual student level, the achievement gap could relate to variables such as family socioeconomic status, low motivation, poor attendance, behavioral factors, or even factors related to student health. But at the school level, I was focusing more on a lack of effective instruction or inequitable access to high-level mathematics coursework. This is the original data from my signature project. In Figure 1, you will see displayed the previous year's data from Saraland Elementary from the ACAP Math Performance Diagnostic. The graph demonstrates a discrepancy across the scores of 2nd through 5th graders between white and African American students. There's a 47% difference in the scores at the 2nd grade level. There's a slight decrease in the gap at 3rd grade with only 36% more whites proficient than African Americans, but the trend increases again at 37% at 4th grade, but then decreases at 15% only in 5th grade. But it does expose a problem at Saraland Elementary that needs improvement. In Figure 2, you'll see the NAEP math data, and it also shows a similar trend in the nation compared to Saraland Elementary. It shows 4th graders from 1990 to 2007. The data reveals that there is also a significant gap in white and African American students in math. It's a constant gap between all the years, ranging from 26 to 35 points. The nation's average for 4th grade students were higher in 2007 than 1990, but there's still a significant achievement gap. Since the Civil Rights Act and the Elementary Secondary Education Act, they were both passed in the 1960s, the government policies ensured that all American students should have equal access to education. Recent policies have placed an even greater emphasis on student outcomes and closing those achievement gaps across different groups of students on achievement tests. According to the National Assessment of Education Progress, the NAEP, achievement gaps occur when one group of students outperforms another group, and the difference in average scores for the two groups is statistically significant. The achievement gap more closely shows that minority students have the most significant deficits. According to my research and my personal experience, I found that superlative teaching strategies implemented in classroom strongly impact proficiency on achievement tests. Murphy's research suggests that schools do make a difference, and a substantial portion of that difference is attributable to teachers. An increasing amount of research assists in identifying schooling conditions linked to student learning. Over the past 45 years, students in the United States have made notable gains in academic achievement. However, racial achievement gaps remain because not all groups of students are advancing at the same rates. Although the white and black achievement gaps have been narrowing nationally over the last decade or more, the rate at which these gaps are changing varies among the states. On the NAEP math test, data shows that an average 13-year-old today scores almost as well as the average 17-year-old in 1978. So in other words, kids today are roughly 3 years ahead of their parents in math skills. On the other hand, the Coleman report found that among other things, in both math and reading, the average black student in 12th grade placed in the 13th percentile of the score distribution. That means that 87% of the white students in grade 12 scored above the average black 12th grader. So achievement gaps are thought to be strongly correlated with educational attainment. I was not able to complete this study all the way through, even though my principal and I still want to make this action plan happen at our school in order to improve our statewide testing. But this research study was created to be used as a qualitative case study, to provide information regarding the achievement gap and how educators can help close that achievement gap. This qualitative study was required to investigate the role of teachers in a student's academic success. The research I used was a purposive sampling technique. The teachers at Saraland Elementary were easily accessed because I taught at the same school as them, and the information would have been sorted by relevance to indicate the most effective teaching strategies that can narrow achievement gap differences between white and African American students. All the 2nd through 5th grade teachers would have been given a questionnaire to find their perceptions of what the best teaching practices to narrow the gap would be. The survey questionnaire would have been collected at the beginning of the study, and I would have used these results to administrate professional development and teaching strategies to the faculty. We would have to work collaboratively to make sure that this project would be successful. Each teacher would have to answer the questionnaire truthfully and agree to implement these strategies in their classroom to fidelity and after the professional development in order to achieve a narrowing gap in achievement. Administration also had to work with me collaboratively in order to give me time and permission to implement my plan. In this study, I would have compiled the research-based literature suggestions and the strategies from the teachers at Saraland Elementary School that could improve the ACAP math test scores and narrow the achievement gap for the upcoming standardized testing between all students. After the research, I would have used the findings to lead a school-wide professional development plan for teachers and inform them and demonstrate the best teaching practices to reduce the gap on ACAP for white and African American students. I would have led the professional development, and the teachers would use those best practices learned in their classrooms to narrow that gap in minorities in the next administration before the next administration of the Math ACAP. The Math ACAP test scores. The ACAP stands for Alabama Comprehensive Assessment Program. It's an online assessment that's designed to provide students and parents and teachers and administrators and Alabama residents with information regarding student progress towards the mastery of the Alabama Course of Study Standards. I discussed the Saraland Elementary School's data trends with my principal, and we concluded that some of the evidence suggests that we cannot control some environmental causes of the data, such as family environment and socioeconomic status. The researcher created questionnaire that I made would be used in this study. My conclusions would only be used on a school basis from school contributions to the achievement gap, such as instructional program, teacher training from the questionnaire. There could be discrepancies in the data because when I compared last year's test scores to this year's test scores, there was a whole new group of students in each grade level. This can cause inconsistencies and weaknesses in the pattern, since the researcher would be compiling two different sets of students. For confidentiality of all the participants in this study, they would be protected to the greatest extent possible. The questionnaires would take place in a quiet and private, peaceful environment. The results involved in this investigation would be kept between me and the administrator. The risks were minimal, yet would be communicated to all the participants verbally and in writing. Participants would be informed of the study's risk. Participants would also be reminded that they could withdraw from the study at any time. They could skip any questions they didn't feel comfortable answering. Participants would be the teachers, and I would tell them about the study's confidentiality and exceptions to it, such as the researcher's role and mandated reporter. Special populations, I guess that would be based upon the ACAP testing for the next season when we test again. If any student who was given the ACAP had an IEP or a 504 plan that allowed them to have accommodations, for instance, they may be allowed to be tested in small group testing or given extra time for the test, that would be granted. The IRB, the Instructional Review Board, is a committee that has been formally constituted to review and oversee research projects involving human participants, and it's in accordance with the FDA standards. If I was able to complete this study, I would expect to see the data to yield the same as my research. I would expect that after the teacher questionnaires would show the best teaching practices that I could have found to improve student achievement, I would hope to see that the data would show that the gap that we would need to close between white and African American students would close. I think if I could have followed through with my action plan to provide that professional development to my colleagues, we would have seen improvement in this gap at the end of year state testing. I would hope to see a closure of that achievement gap in the math ACAP and at the end of the year between those minorities who had been taught using these best teacher practices. My reflection, as I reflected on this, I think if I could change something, I would want to continue professional development plan for the teachers who are at my school currently, and if any new teachers are coming into this next year, so we were all included in these best practices, so we could narrow these gaps in achievement each year to keep consistency. I'd also like to include the middle school and the high school in our district data results to see if they have the same achievement gaps. I would then in turn include these teachers from these schools in the professional development on best teaching practices so that we could have consistency of instruction in our whole school system. We're only made up of 4 school systems. We have early ed, elementary, middle, and high school. I also think that additional research could be done by following these students. As I said before, it was like comparing apples to oranges when I got 2nd grade results from last year to 2nd grade results this year. I would like to follow those students through each grade level to see those results and see if those gaps narrow with that same group of students as they climb through each grade level and gotten older. These are my references that I used for my signature project. Thank you for viewing.